The sound of the slap echoed through the cafe, freezing everything in place. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Coffee cups hovered halfway to lips, and every pair of eyes turned toward the scene that had just unfolded. Elena Carter stood there, her hand still tingling from the impact, her heart pounding like a drum in her chest. Across from her, a man sat in stunned silence, his sharp, chiseled features frozen in an expression of pure disbelief. She hadn't meant to cause a scene. In fact, she hadn't meant to get involved at all. But something about the way he had been leaning toward the woman at his table, the intense look in his eyes, it had set off alarm bells in Elena's mind. Her recent heartbreak had left her raw, and maybe, just maybe, she had been too quick to assume the worst. But it was too late for regrets now. The damage had been done. The man slowly raised a hand to his cheek, his jaw tightening. His piercing blue eyes locked onto hers, filled with something between shock and amusement. "What the hell is wrong with you?" His voice was smooth, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. Panic surged through Elena's veins. What had she just done? She had acted on impulse, convinced she was standing up for someone in need, but now she wasn't so sure. The woman she thought she had rescued looked just as horrified as the man himself. I'm sorry," Elena stammered, but she could already feel the heat of humiliation creeping up her neck. She didn't wait for a response. She spun on her heel and rushed out of the cafe, her heart pounding so hard it hurt. She didn't dare look back. It wasn't until she was halfway down the street that the full weight of what she had done hit her. She had just slapped a complete stranger, and not just any stranger, a man who carried himself with the kind of confidence that screamed power, wealth, and influence. Whoever he was important, and she had just humiliated him in front of a room full of people. Elena spent the rest of the day trying to push the incident from her mind, but the feeling of his eyes on her lingered like a shadow she couldn't shake. It wasn't until the next morning, when she casually scrolled through the news on her phone, that her stomach dropped. There, on the front page of a business website, was the man she had slapped, Alexander Pierce. Billionaire, CEO of Pierce Innovations, one of the most powerful men in the industry. Elena's blood ran cold. Of all the people in the world, she had slapped him. She squeezed her eyes shut, groaning. There was no way she would ever have to face him again, right? But fate had other plans. Elena couldn't stop pacing in her tiny apartment, her mind racing with possibilities. She had slapped a billionaire, a man who had the power to destroy her career before it even started. What if he wanted revenge? What if he pressed charges? The thoughts made her stomach twist with nerves. She tried to convince herself that someone like Alexander Pierce had bigger things to worry about than a random woman making a scene in a cafe. But deep down, she knew powerful men didn't just forget insults like that. And she had humiliated him in public. Days passed, and she heard nothing. No calls, no unexpected visits. Maybe he had let it go after all. But just as she was starting to relax, life threw another curveball. Elena had been searching for a new job after her last company shut down, and she was running out of options. When an unexpected interview invitation from Pierce Innovations landed, in her inbox, she almost dropped her phone. At first, she thought it had to be a mistake. Why would a company like his be interested in her? But the opportunity was too good to ignore. She told herself it had nothing to do with him. The CEO of a billion-dollar company wouldn't personally get involved in hiring interns. He probably didn't even know she existed, right? Walking into the towering glass building, she felt small. The lobby alone screamed wealth and power, and Elena had never felt more out of place. But she pushed down her nerves and focused on the opportunity. This was her chance to start fresh. The interview went better than expected. The manager seemed impressed by her skills, and for a moment, Elena allowed herself to believe that maybe she could actually belong here. Maybe fate wasn't punishing her after all, but fate had one last trick up its sleeve. On her first day, as she walked through the office, she felt an odd tension in the air. She was too focused on not making a fool of herself to notice the way people stole glances at her. Then she saw him. Alexander Pierce stood at the other end of the room, looking as calm and composed as ever. But the moment their eyes met, something in his expression shifted. Recognition. Amusement. and just the slightest hint of something unreadable. Elena's heart slammed against her ribs. This couldn't be happening. There was no way he remembered. But then a slow, knowing smirk appeared on his face. Panic shot through her veins. He definitely remembered. She braced herself for the worst, for him to fire her on the spot or humiliate her in front of everyone. But instead, he simply turned away, as if she were just another employee. Relief flooded through her. Maybe he really had moved on. Maybe she could survive this job without any disasters. But she had no idea that this was only the beginning. Elena walked away, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt foolish, angry at herself for believing there was something genuine between them. She had convinced herself that Alexander Pierce was more than his reputation, that beneath his cold, powerful exterior was a man who could care. But those words, "she's an asset," made it clear. She was nothing more than a useful tool to him. By the time she reached her desk, her decision was already made. She couldn't stay at Pierce Innovations. No matter how good the opportunity was, she refused to work for someone who saw her as just another piece in his empire. That night, she typed up her resignation letter, her hands trembling as she hit send. It was over. The next morning, she expected relief. Instead, she felt hollow. She packed her things, avoiding eye contact with her coworkers, and headed toward the exit. But just as she reached the doors, a voice called out behind her. "Elena, wait." She turned slowly, and there he was. Alexander stood in the middle of the lobby, his usual composed demeanor slightly cracked. His tie was loosened, his expression unreadable. But there was something in his eyes, something she hadn't seen before. "Come with me," he said, his voice quieter than usual. She hesitated. "There's nothing left to say, Alexander. I already sent my resignation." "I know," he admitted. "But that doesn't mean I'm letting you walk away." She sighed, crossing her arms. "I'm not an asset, Alexander. I won't be treated like one." His jaw tightened. "I know. And I was wrong. About everything." Elena searched his face, trying to figure out if this was just another calculated move. But he looked real. Uncertain, even. And that was something she had never seen in him before. "I never meant for you to hear that," he continued. "But that doesn't excuse it. I said it because I was afraid to admit what you really mean to me." He took a step closer. "You changed everything, Elena. You challenged me in ways no one else ever has, and I don't want to lose you." Her heart pounded, but she shook her head. "Words aren't enough, Alexander." He let out a breath. "Then let me prove it." Next thing she knew, he was standing in front of the entire company, calling an emergency meeting, something he never did. Employees whispered, exchanging confused glances, but Elena just stood frozen as he stepped up to the podium. "I owe someone an apology," he said, his voice steady but raw. "I've made mistakes. I've let my fear of vulnerability turn me into someone I don't want to be. And because of that, I hurt someone who matters more than I ever realized." He looked directly at her. "Elena, you are not just an asset. You are the reason I want to be better." The entire room was silent. All eyes turned to her, but Elena barely noticed. Her mind was spinning, her heart aching with emotions she didn't know how to process. When they were alone again, she finally spoke. "I don't know if I can just forget everything, Alexander." "I don't expect you to," he said softly. "I just want the chance to make it right." She studied him, searching for any trace of the man who had once been so untouchable. But in that moment, all she saw was honesty, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough. She let out a breath. "Then let's try." A slow, relieved smile crossed his lips. "No more walls?" She nodded. "No more games." And for the first time, neither of them had to pretend.